Chair of Advocates for Social Justice, let me peek out of here, the Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Santa Rosa. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our Glazer Center, and based on our shared principles, to support the Center for Climate Protection in bringing to you this evening's event. Thank you for coming.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Oh, let's try that one more time. Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Okay. That means good morning. No, I'm kidding. Good evening, everybody. My name is Efren Carrillo, and I'm honored and humbled to be here as the board president of the Center for Climate Protection. First and foremost, I'd like to have you guys join me in thanking our hosts for hosting us here at the Glazer Center. Big round of applause. We are also joined by a few organizations and very key partners and strategic allies who are also co-hosting this event with us this evening. Would like to recognize our friends at 350 Sonoma, 350 Bay Area, the Citizens Climate Lobby, Daily Acts, the Sierra Club, and Transition US. A big round of applause for our So I know that we expected a few of our elected officials and public servants this evening. I did only see Councilman Sam Salmon from Windsor. I don't know if newly elected Councilwoman from Petaluma, Melinda Fisher, is here. Am I looking at Melinda? Thank you both to Melinda. Councilmember Salmon informed me that there's a mayors and council members meeting also taking place this evening somewhere else in the county, and probably the reason why we didn't get more responses. I know in past events we've had a very strong contingency from members of our city councils as well as members of our county board of supervisors. Before I go into the introduction of our keynote speaker and our climate scientist and good friend Carl, I wanted to acknowledge and also thank the volunteers who have put in dozens, if not hundreds of hours in putting this together. They've stayed up late working on this event with the logistics and ensuring that we can get the type of attendance here with us tonight. In fact, this event originally was slated to only have 30 participants at another location, and once we learned that there was a lot of interest on this particular matter, probably the most important matter I think we're facing as a community, and certainly the most important matter that we're facing across the globe. We're grateful to have our friends at Glazer Center open their doors and have the ability to have more friends with us tonight. So a big thank you to all the volunteers who helped us. So after our keynote speaker, I would like to encourage folks to not bolt out and leave. There are a couple things after our speaker is finished that we'd like to share with you. Certainly, I think many of you will be interested with those initiatives and that portion. It won't take long. It shouldn't be more than 10 minutes. So after we're done with the Q&A with Carl, if you could just hang tight with us for an additional a few minutes, we promise that we will get you out of here by 8:30. Before... I was just saying 10 minutes to keep them in, and if you go to 30, no one's going to care. But, 30 minutes, folks. So I still promise to have folks out of here by 8:30. But before Carl does come up, I want to describe how we hope to handle the questions for him. So under your seats, there are 3 pieces of paper. One of them is a 3x5 card. And if you could please just do a huge favor, if you have a question or questions during the talk or after the talk, if you can if you have a pen or a pencil, or you can borrow one from a friend. If you don't have one, we will have volunteers walking around with pens and pencils that we will invite you to share your questions with. So I was asked to not make a formal introduction of Carl. And because he will have the opportunity to have the mic, I am going to respect his wishes. So this will be the shortest introduction of our keynote speaker, my friend and colleague on the Center for Climate Protection. Big round of applause for Carl Mears.
All right, hi everybody. Thanks for coming. I would go through a lot of thank yous, but Efren just did it, so I don't have to. But first I have to figure out how to turn this thing on. There we go. Okay, so the title of this talk is it too late? So I want to talk about a little bit about what it is that, I want to get across here. Okay, well, part of the talk is to provide some hope, ameliorate despair, clarify framing, but on the other hand, I want to, give a realistic view of how hard it is going to be to do this. So I'm aiming for something in between scaring the crap out of you and experts agree everything is fine. Everything is not fine. But that doesn't mean that we should give up trying to fix it, and it doesn't mean that by working hard we can make it a lot better than it would be if we didn't do anything. Okay, so here's how I talk. So who am I? And then I'm going to give you a 3-slide summary of climate science. And then I'm going to talk about how recently there's been a lot of problems with how the question of is it too late and are we all screwed has been framed in the media and then by some of the people that are more alarmed. And then I'm going to talk about the difference. This report just came out I believe in August from the Ipcc that showed, discussed how hard it is to get to 1.5 Kelvin. And a lot of that report had to do with the differences between 1.5 centigrade warming or 2 centigrade warming, and I want to talk about what that difference really means. And then I'm going to talk about what it would actually really take to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees by 2100, and then talk a little bit about how we get there. Okay, so who am I? So I'm a climate scientist. What's that really mean? Do I go outside and see what the weather's like every day? No. I spend all day staring at my computer screen, like many of you do. So my specialty is using satellite data to investigate global scale change. So I take the data from the satellites and then try and see if things are getting warmer, things are getting wetter, whether the wind's getting stronger, the wind's getting less. And the goal of this thing isn't just to show that there is some kind of warming, but to provide the data so that we can see if the climate models, which we're basing on the sphere on, are actually accurate or not. And this talk, is a lot more about projection and policy and that sort of thing. So, I'm a hard science guy, so this is a little bit touchy-feely for me. It's definitely outside my lane, but it's still my highway.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of thing I look at all day. These are some of the data products that my company makes. I'm not going to talk about them anymore. This just shows the temperature of the lower part of the atmosphere last month, and then over there's how that's been changing over the last 40 years. And if you really want to know more about this stuff, you can go to my work website, Remote Sensing Systems, at www.rims.com. This talk's going to be available online, so you don't need to copy down any of these links that I have or anything like that. Okay, because of the work I do, every now and again, they ask me, and I agree, probably against my better judgment, to help write one of these large reports. And this is what we're now calling Volume 1 of the National Climate Assessment, which was released in November 2017. And we had maybe 70 or 80 authors that came together to write this thing. It's huge. It's 477 pages. It came out after Mr. Trump was elected, and there was a lot of fear that the new administration would try and modify this. They did not. Probably because they didn't know it was coming. And the whole thing is designed to be read on the web, so you can read it on the web if you want to, but it is 477 pages. And because I don't want to go into that much detail, I'll show you the summary that one of my co-authors came up with, Catherine Hayhoe. So in one tweet, the report is clear. It's real, as it's warming up. It's us. It's happening now. It's bad. It's getting worse. But our choices can and do make a difference. So do something now. And Dr. Hayhoe, she's a gifted communicator, and she has a YouTube channel, which I totally recommend. If you want to know anything about climate science, you can probably find a YouTube video about it that she produced. Okay, now let's see if I can make this movie go. There it goes. So here's an example of a current day consequence. You know, they always show these sunny day flooding videos or whatever from Miami or somewhere in South Carolina, but this is right here in California. This is last week in La Jolla Shores. So it was a really high tide, and that coupled with the small amount of sea level rise we always had make the water come right onto the streets. And this struck me because this building you see there is a hotel, and I've actually stayed in that hotel. And this is the hotel you stay in when you go visit Scripps Institution of Oceanography. And we're going to rotate over here. That little cut in the sidewalk down there, that's the entrance to their underground garage. So you can see that if there's just about a couple more inches of water, they would be hoping that they had good pumps. Okay, so here's the climate scientist version of the greenhouse effect. You know, sun comes down, it reflects, scatters. Okay, we're not going to do it that way. That's too complicated. So this is all you really need to know. Greenhouse gases are like a blanket. You put a blanket on the baby, what happens? It warms up. Now there might be some question about exactly how much it warms up, and that's why you have big computer models. But the basic physics is simple. You're adding a blanket to the earth, and it's harder to get rid of the heat, and it warms up. Okay, now in this context, the blanket is mostly carbon dioxide, and that comes to the next important climate concept we have to understand. Once you put a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you're stuck with it for a long time. You can think of it as a bathtub. So you're pouring the carbon dioxide in, and unfortunately the drain is pretty small. And so you pour all this stuff in, and it takes hundreds of years to drain out. So that's why you really don't want to pour too much in now, because you're going to be stuck with it for a long time, and it's going to be heating things up for a long time, and melting ice, and so on and so forth. Okay, so as I said, the Ipcc recently released this report about 1.5 degrees centigrade warming. This is kind of motivated by in the Paris Accords, they decided that, the aspirational goal is to try and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And of course, it's hard to get to limit it to 1.5 degrees. So the media's take on this report was, oh my God, we're going off a cliff. And I think this is a really bad framing of the question, because it causes people to just give up and say, nothing we can do is going to make anything any better. So we want to get rid of this framing. Is it too late to do anything about climate change? No, it is not too late. Is it too late to limit warming to 1.5 degrees? Well, maybe, but that doesn't mean that you give up. And here's an alternate framing. So we're stuck on the fossil fuel superhighway, going along. We were supposed to get off at 1.5 degrees, exit 350 there, but we weren't paying attention and we missed our exit. So what do you do when you miss your exit? Oh, you just put the pedal to the metal and drive all the way to Canada, right? No, you slow down, you get more careful, and you try and get off on the next exit and maybe double back. Okay, now the one problem with this metaphor is that, you know, on this picture, you can see up the highway miles, right? But we don't really know what's going to happen when things warm. So the real situation is more and more like this. You have a foggy, curvy mountain road. You don't really know if there are huge potholes up there or what you're going to run into. So what do you do when you come with that situation? Do you just like put the pedal to the metal, go 90 miles an hour? No, you slow down. Okay, a lot of people have heard about tipping points and worry about them. So I thought I'd have a couple slides on that. The idea is that you have some kind of change, and then a big change happens that makes it hard to go backwards. So maybe if I'm going off a small cliff, then it's hard to climb back over, but it's not necessarily a huge cliff. You know, here's an example of a tipping point, and this one's a really scary one, so I'm sorry, but it's easy to explain. So the idea is you have Greenland, which, as you know, is covered with ice. And as we warm up the climate, that ice is going to start to melt. And then you can imagine you get to the point where all the ice melts. And then now, instead of Greenland being covered with ice, now it's all covered with grass and trees and so forth and dirt. And of course, it's hard to reestablish that ice sheet because now the ground is, you know, brown or green or whatever, and it's absorbing a lot more sunlight than it did when it was white. And so it's much, much harder to get the ice to accumulate again. Now this is a huge tipping point, and I'm pretty sure it's not going to happen soon. You know, at the current rate of melting, it's about 10,000 years before you're ice-free in Greenland. Another thing I want to emphasize is there's not like one huge tipping point that we go over and then we're just completely screwed. There's a whole bunch of little ones, and obviously that Greenland one is, you know, much, much bigger than, you know, most of the ones we would have to deal with. You know, around here, a tipping point might be you have a big fire, and the trees all burn up, and then it's pretty hard for those trees to come back because now the soil is no longer shaded. We don't really know exactly where these tipping points are before we come to them, and, you know, we really only know for sure after they've already passed. So this is another thing that suggests that we really ought to slow down. Okay, so you know, I'm a scientist, so I have to show lots of graphs. Okay, so this is kind of a pretty standard plot. This one's probably from one of the Ipcc reports. This shows you know, the average surface warming as a function of time for various what we call, I think these are called representative pathways. And so these, you know, the economists and the scientists got together and came up with these pathways. And the red line, which goes all the way up to 4 degrees of warming by 2100, is sort of the damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, burn all the coal, we don't care scenario. Now, I don't think that one's going to happen because I think, you know, this is existing policies we already have, plus market forces. And by that, I mean things like solar is getting really cheap, wind is getting really cheap, electric cars are coming, and that sort of thing. I don't think we're going to end up at 4 degrees, but we'll probably end up something in the middle if we don't do more. And that's plenty of warming. 2.5 degrees would be plenty bad. And now this most recent report was talking about the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. And that's really a situation where we got to stomp on the brakes and slow down with everything we got. And the rest of the talk is going to be about how we might, you know, what the effects are at these levels, and then also, you know, what we could possibly do to get there. Okay, so how much worse are the impacts at 2 versus 1.5 degrees of warming? It turns out it's really complicated. For some things, there's not very much difference, and then others, there's really a large difference. And if you want to explore these things, there's a really cool comparison at this website called Carbon Brief, which I would recommend in general. But they have this nice thing where you can go to all the different continents and then see what the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and then maybe some higher thing if there was research available to describe it. So here's their comparison for sea level rise for 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. And by 2100, if we manage to limit it to 1.5 degrees, we're going to get about 48 centimeters, about 1.5 foot of rise, and then maybe almost 2 feet of rise if you go to 2 degrees of warming. That's not very much different, right? And it's partly that isn't so much difference because a lot of the sea level rise is actually, we've already put it in the bank at this point. So even if we stop the meeting right now, we would still get sea level rise. So you can see, I kind of made some maps that I got off the web that show what the local effect of 2 and 3 feet of sea level rise is. So this is a map of Petaluma. You can see the Petaluma River there, and then Lakeville Highway. And then this is what it would look like with 2 feet of sea level rise. You can see here, I'm going to flip back and forth because I got distracted. So there's current sea level, and then with 2 feet, you get this blue area down here, down at Schallenberger Park, we're now flooded. But, it's fine in downtown Petaluma. And then at 3 feet, it gets a little bit worse. And most of downtown is fine, and, if you own one of those industrial buildings over on Lakeville Highway, maybe you're starting to get a little bit worried. But, this is not the kind of, huge disaster that, you might have heard about. And I think that that's because, to try and get people's attention, people tend to focus on the most dire thing, and that's that RCP 8.5, where you burn all the coal. In that case, the sea level rise would be more like 6 or 8 feet, and then, Petaluma would be in big trouble. But here's some more consequences. Here's a big chart from, this is from a paper that kind of delved into the differences between 1.5 and 2 degrees. And I'm not going to make you, memorize all these facts. But, the one I really want to talk about that scared me, there's two that are pretty scary. One is this one here, which shows the percentage of coral organisms that are going to be impacted at these 2 levels. If we manage to keep it down to 1.5 degrees, only 90% of the coral is in trouble. But at 2 degrees, it's 98%, and that's a huge difference. That's like a complete destruction of the ecosystem. And then down on the lower part is showing some crop yield predictions for the tropics. It turns out, up where we live, if you can't grow wheat where you live, someone a few hundred miles north of you probably still can. But in the tropics, it's much more serious for wheat and corn, and you get these decreases in productivity of 10 or 15%, which is probably enough to lead a lot of people to starve. And remember, these are for these very optimistic scenarios. And the dam to torpedoes and current policy pathways, all these things would be much worse. Okay, so, can we achieve 1.5 degree warming? Can we limit it to that? And this report that came out, they use these things called integrative assessment models to model future emissions. And these are mostly technological models, so they don't really talk about, what the politics is that needs to get that, you need to get there, and exactly what the economics of the situation will be. It turns out even before you get to policy, it turns out that most of these models that result in 1.5 degrees of warming by 2100 are forced to use negative emissions late in the century to remove CO2. And negative emissions, they include things that are relatively benign, like regrowing forests or sequestering carbon in the soils. But they tend to rely a lot on very industrial solutions, like something called bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So what's that? So this is the idea. So the idea is that you take some land and you grow a bunch of trees or whatever on it, and then you take the trees and you burn them in a power plant, and then you capture the carbon dioxide right there in the smokestack where it's relatively easy, and then you inject it into the ground. Seems easy, right? Okay, now this is the problem with this approach. One, it's not been demonstrated. There's been some pilot plants, but obviously no one's grown a couple thousand square miles of trees or anything like that. And then it's going to take huge amounts of land to grow these fuel crops in order to pull this off. And that probably means that a lot of people aren't going to be able to grow their food. leading to big trouble, particularly for the poorer countries who are already in, have food security issues. But on the plus side, if we did this, there would be a lot of jobs. Another possibility is direct air capture. This is a similar scheme, except instead of using trees, they use clever chemistry to capture the CO2 and then purify it out of the air and then inject it into the ground. And the problem with this, at least so far, is that it's very, very expensive, maybe $300 a ton to do this, where you could probably avoid emissions at a fraction of that cost. But they are doing research on it, which is probably good, because by 2050 or 2060, when we really need to be at net zero emissions, we are probably going to need to capture some CO2 to make up for the CO2 that we put in the air that we really can't avoid. Some things are really hard to decarbonize, like, for example, air travel. So in this report, researchers came up with a lot of pathways to 1.5 degrees, and here's some pictures of them. But I'm going to zoom in on the two most extreme ones on the end. So what these show is, the net amount of CO2 put into the atmosphere each year as a function of time. If you can't see it, it goes from basically now down to 2100. And these are two extreme cases. So on the left-hand side, you have a case where, like, tomorrow we start radically reducing the amount of CO2 we're emitting. And it turns out in that case, if by 2060 we're basically emitting none, then we actually don't need to have this high technology carbon dioxide removal scheme. However, if we kind of laze around, and we wait a couple of decades before we really start reducing, and that's the case here, it's out here by 2040 or something like that, then we need all this negative part down here, which is really the only thing that can do that is some industrial thing, like this reforesting can't provide enough. In fact, the part that could come from planting more trees, more forests, is this kind of tan color, and the yellow color is the high-tech part. So it's really important to start decarbonizing absolutely as soon as possible, otherwise we're going to be stuck with this need for negative emissions later, or either that or we're going to be stuck, with much more temperature rise. But there are some studies, this is a very controversial area, there are some studies that achieve 1.5 degrees of warming without huge negative emissions and without too much suffering. And it turns out that they rely on large increases in efficiency in absolutely every sector, and coupled with relatively small changes in lifestyle. For example, small reductions in the amount of meat people eat. And if you want to read about that, you can go to that reference there. So here's what their pathway was. It's very similar to the one on the left on a couple slides ago. Okay, the other thing is, sometimes these experts don't know everything. And in fact, they actually they make a lot of mistakes when they're projecting what's going to happen in the economy. And it's one of the biggest mistakes that they make year after year after year after year is projecting how much new solar power there's going to be. So this is a plot of how much new solar energy gets added each year. Okay, the big fat one that's kind of going up like that, that's how much actually got added. And then all these colored lines that are coming off more or less horizontally, that's the predictions that were made by the International Energy Agency of what the installation of solar panels was actually going to be. So as I can see, every single year they said, oh, well, there's not going to be any more next year than there was this year. And every single year, it went way, way up. So they don't know everything. And some things like this may happen faster than anyone could possibly believe. Do you know? Yeah. So here's an example of how policy can really change things. So this is a plot of the percentage of electric cars sold in each country in the 12 months leading up to September. Why that is? You know, is it because the Norwegians are better people than us? And then I remembered that they actually still hunt whales. So that's not why it happened. So this is the list of Norwegian electric vehicle incentives on the left. You know, I put it in really small font so you wouldn't even be tempted to read it. But the basic thing is there was huge tax breaks for EVs. EVs got to drive around in the bus lanes and presumably the carpool lanes if they have them. In the downtowns of cities, EV parking is free. And they have lots and lots of charging stations, way more than we do. Of course, they have more electric cars than we do too. So, you know, there's a huge list of things over here. The point is that one policy is not enough. You really need to have a whole bunch of things all pushing in the same direction, and then you really can get a big buy-in. This is what kind of the bottom line is. This is a comparison of how much it costs to buy a gas-powered Golf and an e-Golf in Norway. And you can look at all these numbers, but the basic thing is that the EV version turned out to be $4,000 cheaper than the gas version in Norway. And that's before you even account for how much cheaper it is going to be to drive it around. And I think a similar story can be told about places where there's a lot of wind and where solar has been installed. The policy drove it. Okay, so back to, I'm a big Catherine Hale fan. So back to our summary, we're going to focus on the bottom here, what should we do now? I think it's important, each and every one of us only has a limited amount of energy, and we have to think about what it is that we can do to help out. Okay, so this is what I think needs to happen. We need to clean up electricity, and of course here in Sonoma County we're doing a really good job of that. I hope that you're all evergreen customers. And we need as much renewable as possible, and for the love of God, no more coal plants. If anyone, is, you got to fight them if they propose any in this country. And then we got to reform transport, and that means more than just adopting EVs, though that's important. But even EVs are not free. They still emit carbon, especially as they're being made. So we really need to change, how many miles we all drive. And this is going to be done by improving transit, having some kinds of incentives, and maybe more taxes on driving. And then we've got to make everything as efficient as possible. And that means both houses and industrial processes. Cement is a big problem. When you make cement, it releases a lot of carbon dioxide to the air. And I think I read that if cement was a country, it would be the 4th largest emitter. But people are working on ways to make cement without releasing any carbon dioxide, and we need to support that with, maybe incentives to use that kind of cement. And then probably we're going to end up eating a little bit lower in the food chain in the long run. Okay, so how do we make this happen? To me, there's 3 answers. Policy, policy, policy. I think making your own choices are great, and I think it helps identify you to other members of your tribe. But the only thing that's really going to happen, as Anne would say, at speed and scale, is changing policy. So what can you do? You need to work to elect leaders that care about climate change and will do something about it. And then once they get elected, you have to hold their feet to the fire and make sure that they do something about it. And this is probably only going to happen if everybody talks about climate, to your friends and family, make it a normal topic of conversation. And even that crazy uncle, you got to talk to him too. Okay, well maybe not him. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you so much for coming.
Write your questions on the cards, hold your cards up, and they will be collected right now, and Woody's going to look through them. Bring them to Carl.
Carl, as we're collecting the questions, can you maybe describe the difference between mitigation and adaptation and how those two play a role as addressing?
Okay, so those are mitigation and adaptation are two words that the climate people throw around all the time. What do they actually mean? Mitigation means, doing things to actually reduce the carbon dioxide or the methane or whatever it is in the air. It's really trying to make the problem, less. And then adaptation is you see things coming and you try and change the built economy, the built infrastructure or whatever it is so that those things impact you less. And an obvious example is sea level rise. Sea level rise is coming. So you need to start, figuring out what you're going to do about it. I know that San Francisco is, rebuilding their seawall down on the Embarcadero, and I believe that is a $5 billion project. So these things don't come cheap. And I think starting to talk, like 10 or 15 years ago, I thought, oh my God, we should not talk about adaptation because then I'll get everybody out, and they won't have to worry about it anymore. Let's adapt away from it. But now I realize that talking about adaptation and how much it's going to cost is how you get the attention of the rest of the people. Okay, so question number one. For bioenergy carbon capture and storage, is there an opportunity to utilize biomatter that currently exists, i.e. forest debris, versus having to grow new trees and burn them, pros and cons? Okay, now I think this question is almost off of my highway. You're getting a little bit beyond my area of expertise, but I'll try and take some educated guesses. I think that, the amount that currently exists isn't enough. It's just not enough stuff. And, and as far as raking the forest, Trump style, and burning everything, you have to realize that if you do that to the forest, you're going to mess up the entire ecosystem, and it's not really clear to me that it can still exist as a forest. And that's kind of a problem I have with the bioenergy in general, is that a lot of that stuff when you farm, it rots there on the field and goes back into the soil, and probably the plants need that, right? Okay, and then next question. What can we do to decarbonize air travel? I think about this a lot because, I like, traveling around and seeing other countries and stuff like that, going to conferences. I'm really not sure. You could make your jet fuel out of biofuels, but then that has all the same problem we just discussed. Maybe you can have like a slower form of air travel where you go up in your dirigible and you get in the jet stream. It takes you 6 days to get to Europe. Probably the best thing is just stay home. Okay, what about ocean warming? That is a very important question, and it turns out, the extra heat that the greenhouse gases trap, about 90% of it goes into the ocean. And of course, the ocean warms up. And I think, even beyond ocean warming, so obviously, you warm up the ocean, and then some plants that are animals that used to live in that place can't live there anymore. And, the corals, as I discussed earlier, they go through these bleaching things where they expel their symbiotic algae and then they die. And then the other thing that happens when the CO2 goes into the ocean is that it becomes more acidic, and then it gets all the kinds of animals that make shells. They have a much harder time making those shells. So the oceans are definitely something that I worry about a lot.
This one is my favorite so far.
What are you doing tomorrow morning? Would you like to be a guest speaker in my 8th grade science class? Well, maybe not tomorrow, but get in touch with me. Okay, now here's another off my highway one. What can be done to make the soil for a carbon sponge? You know, there's people in this county that know a lot about this, but it's not me. So I think I'm not gonna make an idiot of myself trying to answer that one. Can you talk more about industry and large sources of emissions? Let me table that for a minute. How can teenagers help the community? You know, I think the most important thing for teenagers to do is get ready to vote.
Yes.
And talk to that crazy uncle.
Yes.
Talk to your parents. You know, talk to other relatives, talk to your friends, and make it a normal part of conversation. Okay, is the cold snap in the middle of the country climate change related?
Yes.
If so, can you give us a brief explanation? You know, I've seen a lot of things both ways on this in the past week. You know, so what causes the cold snap in the middle of the country is normally, you know, all that cold air is up over in the North Pole, and there's winds that go around the North Pole like this. That's the polar vortex. And those winds kind of keep the cold air there. It's like a little fence or something like that. And every now and again it becomes unstable, and the vortex splits into two, and then one of them moves somewhere else. And in this case, it moved over Chicago, or really a little bit north of Chicago. There are some people that say, oh, well, these vortex splitting events will become more common in the future, basically because in the future there'll be less temperature difference between the pole and the equator. But I think that's a little bit, it's not proven science yet, and it's going to take a long time to prove that, because these things only happen once or so a year, so you need to wait a long time before you get enough observations to really be clear about if your theory is right or not. Does emission modeling account for the release of carbon from fires, hurricanes, melting ice, and so on and so forth? I think it does. And it definitely tries to account for the release of greenhouse gases by things like melting permafrost, which you might have heard about. When the permafrost melts, it tends to emit a lot of carbon dioxide and methane. And so those things are, in these emission models, but in a very broad kind of, non-specific sort of way. All right. Oh, here's a controversial one. Jane Hansen and others have said that nuclear energy needs to be included to remove the CO2 that would be released by coal and oil. My comments. Okay, I'm probably going to break with my organization here. I think what I would do would be, I wouldn't turn off any nuclear power plants that are currently going. That seems crazy. But, I also think that, it's a very expensive way to get power, and it's probably only going to get more expensive because the next time you build them, you're going to have to build them way, way safer. So I think it's just going to be too expensive, and it's not going to be competitive with solar plus wind plus batteries. And then maybe other kinds of storage. There's all, besides batteries, you can, everyone says, oh, you can't do solar and wind because, sometimes the wind doesn't blow and sometimes the sun's behind a cloud. But if you could just, store some energy, then, you can make it all work. And there's actually a large body of evidence now suggesting that you can have like 80 or 90% of the grid be solar and wind and everything's still okay. Okay, this one I'm going to defer to Anne. What current current legislation and policy solution you think is most important? Here, I'll just hand it to you right now.
Thank you, whoever.
Okay, if we want change, shouldn't we focus our efforts in educating our youth? Yes, of course. That's why the Center for Climate Protection has a youth program. Say something about the role of methane. How do we reduce methane production? Okay, methane is the second most important greenhouse gas. It accounts for about a quarter of the effect. And it's probably, some parts of it are probably pretty hard to get rid of because a lot of it comes from various farming practices. Like when you farm rice in the field, it makes a lot of methane. But other of it comes from when you're drilling for natural gas and you have a leak. So you can definitely cut down the methane emissions by having better regulation on natural gas production. Now, I worry a little bit less about methane than I do carbon dioxide because when you put methane in the atmosphere, it goes away in a couple of decades. So if you can figure out how to stop emitting it, then the problem will go away. Carbon dioxide takes hundreds or maybe not thousands of years to go away, so it's a much bigger problem. Okay, so studies show that there have been increases in greenhouse gases in the past, before humans existed. Given this, do 99% of scientists really believe in climate change? We don't believe in anything. 99% of scientists have concluded, based on the evidence, that there's human-induced climate change. Okay, now, the other question is, obviously the climate has changed in the past. The paleontologists tell us, and 40 million years ago, there was crocodiles swimming around in the North Pole, and the whole thing was full of duckweed. Why was that? Well, it's because there was more CO2 in the atmosphere back then. And why was that? That was because of slow geological processes. In that case, it had to do with volcanoes emitting a lot of CO2 and then changes in how fast the ocean floor is spreading. And all the details of that I'm not totally up on, but it's a fascinating thing. Over the summer I went on a rafting trip down the Grand Canyon and went through all those different layers, and I got really interested in what causes the changes 200 or 300 million years ago. And I'm not going to go into it now, but it's fascinating. I recommend it. It says, China burns half of the world's coal each year. How can we best influence China to lower its contribution to greenhouse gases? Okay, that's a whole different interstate system. What I know about. But I just will say that China also leads in solar and wind installations.
Right, absolutely.
So they're aware of the problem.
And electric cars.
They've got to feed their people and figure everything out. And I think it's things like the Paris Accord and international agreements that can force them in the right direction. Now, isn't 1 degree centigrade already too hot? And that's actually about how much warming we've already had. Some days I think we can't change political will soon enough. Other days I get optimistic. We get the technology, we lack the politicians. I agree with all of that. But it is, it's like, we have 1 degree of warming now, and we're all still surviving. Some things are bad, but we're not dead yet.
Knock on wood.
And it's important that we have 1, but we'd like to avoid 2, and we would certainly like to avoid 3. So that's why we need to hold the politicians' feet to the fire. Okay, this is exactly what I was trying to, reframe. There's recent information that says that we have as little as 12 years to dramatically reduce greenhouse gases. Please comment on where new reports are coming from. So I would say that was, people read the media things about the Ipcc report, and, it turns out that, well, if you just business as usual, in 12 years, we'll have burned an amount of CO2 that's going to get us above 1.5 degrees. That's fine, but that doesn't mean that you just throw your hands up and say, we don't have zero CO2 emissions in 12 years, all is lost. It'll be, worse than it would have been if, we did manage to do that. One, framing I hear from time to time is just like quitting smoking. When was the best time to quit smoking? Well, 10 years ago. When's the next best time? Now. But, you probably, even if you quit 5 years from now, it's better than smoking for your whole life. All right. Can you be more specific about eating lower on the food chain? That was my euphemism for not eating as much meat. And, and that probably also means not eating as much dairy, too, because dairy is a fairly inefficient way to get calories. If the crazy uncle was a climate change denier, how do you talk to him? Heck if I know. The things I've seen, I don't have any really crazy people in my family to practice on, so. But, what I hear is that you should try and establish, some common ground, some shared values, and then go from there. And it might be the shared value is you want to save money on your energy bill. All right. Help me understand a gigaton in our atmosphere. Ooh, I should have been prepared for that. So gigaton is 1 billion tons. So let's think. So good. Figuring in my head. A gigaton is probably something like if you had a cube of water a few kilometers on the side, that would be a gigaton. So obviously a huge amount of something. Talk about black carbon. So black carbon is another form of pollution. So carbon dioxide is an odorless, colorless gas that you probably wouldn't even notice. Black carbon is like the nasty stuff that comes out of diesel trucks and out of coal-fired power plants and stuff like that. And it goes up in the air and it's black, so it absorbs a lot of solar energy and heats up the air. So it's a very efficient greenhouse effect causer, I guess, warming causer. And then on the other hand, those same things also, you can get sulfate aerosols, and they go up in the stratosphere and they block the sun. So the two particulate things tend to cancel each other out to some degree. And then I think the thinking is these days that the sulfate aerosols are more important, and if, for example, if we suddenly got China to quit burning all that coal, then we'd actually temporarily get a temperature increase because the sulfate aerosols would all go away in a few months or something like that. I'm still trying to figure out what to say about this, sources of, large sources of emissions from industry. I think, I think everything, everything we do and consume, tends to emit some amount of emissions, but almost all of those things can be made much more efficient, especially if they're pushed that way with regulations. And what do you think the role of teachers should be? obviously educating the youth to vote for, climate-aware politicians.
Carl, I'd make my way up here. There's a lot of discussion at the federal level around the new Green Deal. I'm guessing there's some folks in the room that they've heard about it.
I haven't read the idea sounds great to me. And I think the idea is, you take a bunch of money that you get from taxing, maybe people that make $10 million or something like that, and you invest that in doing these things we need to do to transform the economy. And that includes things like putting solar and wind everywhere, and all those kinds of things. Maybe, putting in pump storage facilities on dams, all these kind of big infrastructure things that we really need to address the problem. Public transit, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. So as I said at the beginning, if we could encourage folks to not depart just yet. Carl did ask me not to do a long introduction of him at the beginning, and I didn't want him to say anything bad about me, but now that he's done, Carl is one of the foremost scientists in this field, and for us to have him here in our community to share his experience and his background in academia, not only as a doctorate from UC Berkeley as a physicist, but someone who can convey a very difficult subject in terms that the average person like I can understand. It takes a particular talent, and by the way, he's also funny, which you don't always get with PhD physicists. So, Carl, once again, thank you so much for your expertise. So it's my great honor to introduce Larry Robinson, who is a recognized poet in our community, and someone who I look up to and hope to be like someday. He's my colleague on the Center for Climate Protection Board of Directors. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Larry Robinson to the stage.
Thank you, Efren. And on behalf of the board of the center, I want to offer Carl a little token of our appreciation for your wisdom and
It's not full.
So here we are trying to find this sweet spot between naive hope and despair. And what I call naive hope is really the fantasy, the rescue fantasy, that the billionaires in Davos are somehow going to figure out the solution and make things happen for us, or that engineering solutions are going to save us and we can go on doing what we've been doing. And despair, on the other hand, is also disempowering. Real hope requires courage, and hope is not a feeling. It's a choice. And it's a choice that we have to keep making again and again and again. Because that is how we find the energy to do the work that we have to do. So I want to share a poem by Denise Levertov, which is really a prayer of hope. It's dedicated to the memory of Karen Silkwood, and I think those of us in my generation remember her work and her sacrifice. So Denise says, "But we have only begun to imagine justice and mercy. So much is in bud. How can we tire of hope? We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How can desire fail? We have only begun to know the power in us if we would join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. Surely our river cannot already be hastening into the sea of non-being. Surely it cannot drag in the silt all that is innocent. Not yet. Not yet. There is still so much broken that must be mended. So much our focus has to be. And no one else is going to do it for us. There will be no rescue. But we can do it. And in just a moment, Anne is going to show us the pathway. Please. So one more poem, and then I'm going to give it to Anne. Annie Dillard says, "There is no one but us. There is no one to send, nor clean hand, nor pure heart on the face of the earth, but only us. A generation comforting ourselves with the notion that we have come at an awkward time. That our innocent fathers are all dead, as if innocence ever were. And our children busy and troubled, and we ourselves unfit, not yet ready, having each of us chosen wrongly, made a false start, failed, yielded to impulse and the tangled comfort of pleasure, and grown exhausted, unable to seek the thread, weak and involved. But there is no one but us. There never has been." So Anne is going to tell us what we can do and what we are doing as we join our solitudes in the communion of struggle. Thank you.
Wow, huh? So, how about we transform angst to action? Yeah?
Yeah.
So, you may be asking yourself, what can I do? And according to Bill McKibben, our climate leader in the world, he says that's the wrong question. The right question is, what can we do? So what can we do to deliver speed and scale solutions to deal with the climate crisis? Like many of you, we at the Center for Climate Protection ask ourselves this question all the time. And even in the beginning, in 2001, we said, what can we do? We can get all of our cities in the county to become climate leaders. And we did this, and we followed the motto, local action moves the world. And from this came Sonoma Clean Power. Sonoma Clean Power is so powerful that in 2016, Sonoma County's greenhouse gas emissions were lower than they were in 1990, even though our population and our economic activity increased. That is a speed and scale solution. And so we at the Center for Climate Protection have prioritized this speed and scale solution, and we're moving it across the state of California. And one of your handouts shows two maps of the state of California, one 2 years before the other, and it shows the progress that we have made. It's really astonishing in the way that Sonoma Clean Power has spread across California. So let's hear it for Sonoma County helping, along with Marin, leading the way and transforming California. And for our Facebook audience, we have posted links to our handouts so that you, on Facebook, so you can go there and find out what we're talking about here. The rest of you have it underneath your seats. So the underlying strategy to deliver speed and scale solutions is shown graphically on another one of your handouts, the one that is called Climate Solutions at Speed and Scale. And as Carl said, the essence of this is policy, policy, policy. But there's another piece to this, which is activists, activists, activists. Yes. So, activists are the ones who put the wind in the sails of politicians. Activists are the ones who elect people. So, you know, we're the place where it starts. And we've gathered evidence to support this strategy that you see on your handout. And our intention at the Center for Climate Protection is to build alignment within the climate movement so that we become more powerful and more effective at delivering bigger and more powerful speed and scale solutions. So right here, I'm going to say, in answer to this question about what current legislation or policy solution do you think is most important, the one that we identify at the Center for Climate Protection, and many others do as well, is a price on carbon. That then pays a dividend to people. If we could, you know, get a price on carbon and give the money back on a per capita basis, we would not only solve the climate crisis, we would solve the equity crisis as well. The fact of the matter is, we have to build a lot more political power, a lot more climate constituents to make that kind of thing happen, and it is such a worthy goal. And I myself am up to it, and I know probably every one of you is as well. So, speed and scale. These are the questions, these are the words that we have to remember when we ask ourselves, what can we do together? So, as alluded earlier, one of the things we have to do is turn our attention to transportation. Transportation is the sector that produces the most greenhouse gas emissions in Sonoma County, in California, and in the United States. So, we have a big opportunity here in California. There is a new piece of legislation that's been proposed, AB 40. And it's not very similar. It's similar to last year's AB 1745, which would have mandated that every new passenger vehicle in California starting in 2040 would be a zero net energy, a zero emission vehicle, which is a really fantastic thing. And there is another handout that explains why we have to set a date certain so that we start to move the markets. And as you know, when California does something, it influences the rest of the United States. So, AB 40 mandates that the California Air Resources Board complete a comprehensive plan by 2021 to electrify California's transportation sector by 2040. And this revised strategy was developed by a coalition of state climate and environmental groups, including ours, following Big Oil's successful opposition to AB 1745. So they came out strong, Big Oil did, and Assemblymember Ting just pulled the bill before he got a no vote. The strategy of starting with a planning bill to make electrification of the transportation sector happen is modeled after a successful law that dealt with short-term climate pollutants. So this is why we figured this strategy, we would revise 1745 and go to AB 40. To pass AB 40, we need a groundswell of support. We need to put the wind in the sails to make this happen. We contacted Ting's office, his legislative director, and we said, how can we support AB 40? And he said, have people send letters and emails of support to our office now. So one of your handouts, and it is called Only Clean Cars in California, tells where to send your emails and where to send your letters. And it gives you some ideas about what to put in the letter, and a reminder that if you put it in your own words, it counts extra. When they feel like it's just kind of like a form letter, it's not the same. So, what do you think? How many of you, raise your hand if you are willing this week to send an email or a letter? Yeah. Awesome! Okay, good. Let them know in Ting's office we're there for them. Okay, but wait, there's more. There's a card under your seat called Call to Action. This one. And before going any farther, I want to acknowledge that last year in this room in March, we had a Call to Action card, and about 100 of you filled those cards out, probably many of you in this room. And I want to thank you for those. When Ting pulled the bill, we did call you and contact you and move you into action. This time, we're going to call and contact you. And who's in charge of this is Jane Bender, and she is unstoppable. Where are you, Jane? All right. So now is the time to please fill in your card if you need a. And I hope most of the card is clear and self-explanatory. And we acknowledge that there's plenty of crossovers in some of those categories. And as you're filling out the card, I'll just kind of make a few remarks. Anybody need a pen or a pencil? Raise your hand. There's a hand raised. Thank you. So legislation is advocating for AB 40 and other speed and scale solutions. Outreach, making calls, going to meetings. Volunteer logistics for you who love to make things organized. Check that box. Fundraising for you who aren't afraid to ask for money or even enjoy it. Really check that box. So the next two, living in Assemblymember Aguiar Curry's district and connecting us with people in Napa, Solano, Contra Costa, Oriolo counties. Those are districts represented by key assembly members, and they're close enough that we can do outreach and help groups in those areas. So if you can help connect us with people in those areas, please check that box. Of course, we are fueled by your contributions. Many of you have made contributions to us through the years, and we're so grateful. If any of you want to make a contribution tonight, we welcome that. It helps make our work possible. Please give us your contact information, and there will be volunteers at the door as you exit to collect these cards. We will be sending a follow-up email to you with Larry's poems, with Carl's slides, with some of the handout information, with some photos from tonight, so you can look for an email from us. I think it's going to go out tomorrow. So, it is now my pleasure to, first of all, thank you so very, very much for who you are and what your commitment is and what you do and how we work together for speed and scale solutions. And Larry, I'm going to reintroduce you to take us home.
Well, I'm going to make this very short. This is really not a poem. It's a little quote from the Talmud that says, "Do not be daunted by the suffering of the world. Do justice now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You were not obliged to complete the work. Neither are you allowed to forget it. Walk humbly now. Love mercy now. Do justice now." Thank you.